Hello and welcome. I'm Aubrey Anthony. I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Technology and International Affairs program. I am thrilled to be joining you today for what I'm sure will be a rich discussion on where and how global AI governance, the global AI governance agenda can expand to better contend with the perspectives and priorities of the global majority. Artificial intelligence as a field has been evolving for quite some time, and its more mainstream use has been steadily expanding in the last decade or so. But with the public release of ChatGPT in 2022, AI's use has skyrocketed. And this has, in many ways, pushed an urgency around the question of how we ensure that AI leads to more benefit than it does harm. Essentially, how we govern AI for humanity. And while there are several long-running initiatives that have worked to map out what AI governance should entail at a global scale, many of them draw heavily from experiences and expertise in the so-called global north. But AI is, of course, not confined to the global north. And scholars and policymakers worldwide have been wrestling with how to ensure AI brings benefit to their communities and how to protect against AI-borne harm in ways that may be unique to their communities. Through our AI and the Global Majority project, we at Carnegie have been lucky enough to work with a set of scholars and practitioners to produce a series of thematic papers exploring how harms arise when those in the global majority interact with AI. And today, we have an opportunity to hear directly from some of these scholars who have contributed their thinking toward illuminating what's missing when global AI governance skews so heavily toward the global north. Across the work of many of the speakers that are today, there are a few themes that are worth foregrounding. And so throughout the panels today, you'll likely hear many of us speak in terms of how AI affects not just the global south, but also the global majority. So just to clarify, in our report, we specify that that term refers to the communities that make up the majority of the world's population demographically. And also, this is the majority population that has experienced some form of exploitation, racialization, and or marginalization in relation to the global minority. So in this work, we use the terms global majority and global minority when discussing individuals and communities that exist within the context of historical power disparities. We often use the terms global south and global north when addressing nation states, geographies, and institutions. So you'll hear us flip back and forth between those different terms today. And this framing of global minority versus global majority allows us to better center the discussion in some ways around how power is currently distributed and to bring more attention to the current imbalance in that power, in which a very small minority of the world's population, centered primarily in the global north, is largely driving the production and creation of AI and also making consequential governance decisions around a technology that has significant impacts on the whole world. So I want to dive right into our first panel because we have a number of scholars that we want to hear from. We've divided our time into two panels. And so we'll ask that those of you joining us online, as you have questions, please go ahead and log those in the chat. We'll move on to questions after we've gone through both panels. So for our first panel, we'll bring everyone onto the screen. We're very excited to be joined by an illustrious panel of folks. So first we've got Jake Okechukwu-Afodu. He's assistant professor at the Toronto Metropolitan University Lincoln Alexander School of Law. We have Rachel Gong, deputy director of research at the Kazana Research Institute. We have Junie Tan, a senior research associate also at the Kazana Research Institute, and Ranjit Singh at he's a senior researcher at the Data and Society Research Institute. Welcome all. So I want to start our discussion by briefly framing my questions with a recognition that yes, many of the challenges that AI poses are indeed universal. But in spite of that, there are certain dynamics that arise uniquely in the context of these power asymmetries that we've been talking about in the introduction. And one specific way in which I think there are distinctions that are worth dwelling on here is that AI is unique in how it inherently reflects the society creating it. This is distinct from many other types of technology we've had to contend with in the past. And this is in large part because AI is not just a technology, it is a socio-technical system, right? This means that AI is both shaped by society and it in turn shapes the society around it. This is kind of an ongoing feedback loop. And so that creates distinct challenges when these power asymmetries that I mentioned and the centralization of production occurs in the global north. So with that, I want to begin this conversation with each of you weighing in on what it means for AI to be a socio-technical system in your context. So let's first turn to Jake. So Jake, with you, first question to you. So in the papers that you all have shared, you each cover different themes. And Jake, in your paper, you discuss how concepts like explainability and trustworthiness, which are very universal in many ways, but are also very largely shaped by those in the global north, how those particular principles and concepts could benefit from being more intentionally rooted in the global south context. So I would love for you to speak a little bit to those themes and how they come up in your paper, and give an example or two of how explainability as it's currently understood seems to be falling short. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Obra, and for Carnegie for setting up this conversation. I think it's really critical, very important to get global majority perspectives on a very important technology. So thanks, Obra and the team, for setting this up. Yes, when we talk about explainability and trustworthiness, I think these are things that everyone loves to hear about. We want to ensure that AI systems can give us responsible explanation or disclosure as to how these systems operate, right? But there are two challenges inherent here. One is the fact that there is a lack of clarity or a lack of consensus on what is truly, like, what can we say something is truly explainable? Are there common yardsticks or benchmarks for these AI systems to meet? And sort of who sets them? So explainability is a very broad construction that requires a lot of contextualization. And I think the second possible challenge is the fact that when we look at explainable AI, they're at the moment deeply rooted in Western perspectives, which is great, very helpful, but they've been quite limited in the way that they cut across some subaltern cultural or contextual landscape. And in my paper, I give an example that in light of the OECD prescription for AI tools to provide some meaningful explanation, some meaningful information that people can understand the context or the logic that an AI-generated decision makes. I give an example that, if you look at some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, the AI tools that I came across, during my research did not assess creditworthiness in a way that the people in the region sort of understood, right? It did not offer an explanation for the financial reliability or the creditworthiness that is demonstrated in ways that only certain people in that community could understand. So the Western perspective is that individualistic ideations is what amounts to who is creditworthy and who is not. But if you look at what we practice as a chama in East Africa, in Kenya, for example, where members, mostly women, will contribute money regularly and use that money that they contributed for various purposes, their involvement in the chama, a more communitarian perspective to their creditworthiness, is also relevant to how much money they have and can spend or use. So the lack of recognition, the gap in the recognition of such a local financial practice that is so central to the lives of these people is missing in the ways that the AI models functions and impairs without such recognition. So when it comes to explainability, the dominant context of a model's training being mostly about the individual, the personal creditworthiness, seems to be quite commonplace. But when you transpose it to a place like, Kenya, where they use the chama, or Nigeria, where they use something called esusu or adashe, this credit-related AI system needs to explain to the people the context within which it's operating, the benchmarks, the climbs that it's relying on to ensure that these people's lived realities, be it trade by barter systems, be it commodity monies or the chama, is reflected within the use of those AI systems.
Yeah, and I'm struck by both how a lot of what you're talking about has to do with explainability, but also it just has to do with the robustness of these models across a variety of contexts, which is the reality that we face here. And so I'm curious if you can share a little bit. In your paper, you talk about some of the potential solutions for addressing these variable contexts, right? There's no way that any one AI model is going to be robust across all contexts without some sort of human support feeding into that information about how things differ. And so in your piece, you detail a couple of concepts, for example, the griot or midwife for a model. And so I would love for you to share a little bit about these potential creative solutions for addressing this lack of kind of explainability across cultures.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right, Obra. Sometimes it's about the lack of robustness, but it's also a lack of explainability about that robustness, or a lack of explainability about the lack of representation in terms of the data that the models were trained on. Some of the ideas that I propose are not mine. They're things I witnessed in the field across sub-Saharan Africa doing my research in Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. I believe that a technical problem can be addressed both technologically, but also through non-technological interventions, because you've mentioned AI is a socio-technical technology. And I think one of the ideas that I proposed is the need to incorporate human explainers. And yeah, it might seem basic, yeah, but in some communities, people need the touch, the explanation to speak to a human being about how they're relating to an AI system. So I talk about incorporating human explainers as intermediaries, as midwives between AI systems and the users. And I think it's worth to explore, especially because when you look at certain societies, we have the tradition of seeking guidance or seeking interpretation from many people. So if you look at various African societies and indigenous communities, say like in Mali or Senegal, we have like griots or jalis. These are people who understand the context of a situation, people who we rely on for histories, for traditions, for explanations. And I think if we use these people who mobilize the skills of music or storytelling or mediation to help translate information to their communities, these same type of human explainers can be deployed when it comes to the use of AI. And so I explained in my work how these AI explainers in Tanzania were acting like a griot-like capacity, where local women who use the services of an NGO, like pregnant women in Tanzania, who couldn't access the services of like medical doctors, were able to use some ultrasound videos that helps them understand the status of their pregnancies. And so there's an AI tool that has like ultrasound scanners that are Bluetooth enabled, and they're able to help these women sort of capture information from like images about their from their bodies to what the doctors actually like prescribe for them and all that. So if you look at how these women were able to engage with this AI system, they had explainers, and these explainers were mostly like midwives, would have like basic knowledge about how the AI systems function, and they were able to explain to these women the user interface, the user experience, the performance metrics, what to explain. And I find that these explainers served a whole lot more value for these women in understanding technology and just filling out the gaps where there might be misinterpretation or a lack of understanding about the use of these AI systems. So these AI explainers, in the way that I put it, are able to provide basic contextual explanations, able to solve issues around errors, but can also provide feedback to the developers around areas that they might need to improve upon. For example, the tablet simulations that the women used, they were mostly in English, right? And sometimes you might recognize that in Tanzania, Swahili is a more recognizable language that these women can do. So even if it's just language translation, that provides a whole lot more value. But in my work, I explain about 5 to 6 ways that these human explainers can serve a lot of value, not only for the people who use the AI systems, but also for those who develop it, as well as for policymakers as well.
Yeah. I think those are really important points, Jake, because at the end of the day, much of this work has to come back to answer the question of how you establish trust in AI and how you merit trust in AI. and ignoring the human connection of how understanding what's behind the model, what's behind the decision making, what's behind any of that means that there will be a lack of trust. I want to move now just quickly to Ranjit. Ranjit, welcome. And in your work, you specifically present the concept of ordinary ethics, which is, I thought, a very innovative, a different way to approach ethics than is currently customarily done in this kind of global north framing that's been adopted by many technologists, where at least today, a huge focus in terms of ethics and risk is around large-scale, existential, catastrophic risk. And you argue for the importance of reframing in terms of the everyday experiences of who's interacting with these models on a day-to-day basis. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about this framing and offer some examples of what that looks like in practice throughout different contexts in the Global South.
Thank you, Abra. I think one of the ways in which I kind of look at the framing of ordinary ethics, I kind of take it back to the original question that you asked, which was, how do we actually think about AI as a socio-technical system? And when we kind of take that insight around, how society and technology mutually shape each other and think through what that really implies, we can sort of start thinking through what it means for us to basically then locate ourselves in places where we realize that when it comes to large language models, for example, it is not just the models that should not have problematic outputs. It's also how we understand whether a model is giving an output that is problematic and be able to recognize it. So it's kind of how we shape each other in a way. In a very similar sense, the example that I usually think of when it comes to describing what it means to actually think about socio-technical systems is, for example, car is a technology that allows us to travel distances. But how it moves on the road is a socio-technical phenomena, which is governed by traffic laws and driving licenses. So to a certain extent, we can think about how certain features of AI are technical, but at the same time, they're kind of fundamentally grounded in the way in which we think about how it should be interfaced with the world in general. And, how. So the question of ordinary ethics kind of lies at this particular interface of, technology with people and what that interaction kind of looks like and how do we actually start thinking about it. And that invitation is fundamentally a way to start thinking about how we imagine what our future should be when it comes to these technologies. There's it goes without saying that no technology or social arrangement is permanent. And it requires work and consistent commitment to start thinking about what the future should be like as we are incorporating AI into our everyday life. And that, to a certain extent, is a broad frame within which I think about ordinary ethics in itself as a phenomenon. So when I started working on trying to map the conceptual vocabulary of AI in the majority world, part of the reason why that investigation was important to me was primarily because I was noticing this difference between the ways in which these concepts are kind of articulated across global north and global south. So, for example, in the United States and Europe, the core ethical concepts that we would basically engage with would be fairness, bias, explainability, accountability, human-centered design. And all of these ideas allow us to start thinking about AI and computational systems in general to be mostly a tool that is used in order to do something, right? But if you kind of take a step back and start thinking about what is the scholarship of Global South that is speaking to the same set of problems, you will encounter keywords like extraction, colonialism, dignity, solidarity, which are fundamentally different in the way in which they orient themselves, and they're placed and theorized as a way to think about what is my experience of dealing with these technologies. And in that sense, partly the framing of ordinary ethics comes from this recognition that there is a part of this work which is about how do we experience these technologies and what do we do about them. So the way in which I frame it in my work, especially in this paper, is that increasingly the problem that we are looking at is that computational systems have been given a lot more agency in determining what are the kinds of outcomes that people have to deal with on an everyday basis. And this could be simply like, who is eligible for welfare as a simple way of thinking about, how computational systems are used by government, more broadly, facial recognition in criminal investigations. But there is also, as Jake pointed out, a whole set of infrastructure that is built around credit scores as a way to determine creditworthiness. And in each of these cases, computational systems have agency in determining outcomes for people. And one of the ways in which I can illustrate this is to basically run with Jake's example and kind of provide an example from the United States as a way to contextualize some of these issues. I did a study on how people go about repairing their credit scores in the United States. And I followed a bunch of folks trying to repair their credit scores over a span of a year and a half. And as I was following one of them, Morris, who's a Black professional artist with variable income, he was trying to basically find a new townhouse, an apartment, because his partner had become pregnant and they were looking for a new place to live. Now, his score was okay, but his partner's score was really bad. So together, when they were making an application to actually rent a place, their applications kept getting rejected. So ultimately, he goes on to basically finally speak to the manager of this property and give him a sense of, we are a new family, we are trying to find a new house, and I would really need your help. And in the process of that negotiation, this manager kind of asks him to basically list his wife as a roommate in his application. And that, to a certain extent, allowed them to actually rent that the place that they really wanted. And that kind of illustrates this problem of ordinary ethics as the way in which I put it. Because, here is a negotiation where, what is being represented to a computer system is not really accurate, but it gets the job done in a way where it allows for people to access services and, opportunities which would otherwise not be accessible to them if there was only a computational system that was interfacing between people and access to a particular service. And that, to a certain extent, brings up these kinds of issues that I kind of broadly address in my piece, which is what is the kind of data-driven delegation that is happening on an everyday basis in our experiences, where part of the reason why we are confronted with these issues is primarily because we are dealing with systems deciding outcomes in a way. What are the kinds of mandatory data categories that people have to navigate on an everyday basis to think about, how they can access a particular service? And then finally, the amount of work that you have to do in order to actually get these systems to work. So in Morris's case, you can easily see that, this entire work required him 6 months of negotiations to finally create an application that would work in order for him to be able to actually secure a new rental place. So that, to a certain extent, exemplifies what I mean by ordinary ethics, which is how do we on an everyday basis make these judgments which are, embedded in a moral, code, but at the same time do not, represent this larger questions of fairness, but are kind of resolved on an everyday basis as we are kind of dealing with these problems as they appear when we are trying to interface with these systems.
It's really interesting, Ranjit, and thanks for such a stark example. I think earlier on in your remarks, you hit on something which is in many ways almost kind of the core challenge of this work that we wrestled with internally at Carnegie, which is many of the universal principles that are out there are completely valid. Fairness, bias, all of these things are very important for the whole world. So what is it that's unique about the global majority? And I think the way that you framed it in terms of how historical patterns, historical power asymmetries, all of this influences day-to-day interactions in a way that is unique to the global majority. And the way that AI is infusing in those day-to-day interactions is exacerbating a lot of these issues. So I think that this ordinary ethics framing is really valuable for that reason. That gets us to the very difficult question, which is what do you do about it? That's great to have this framework, but how does that lead to better governance decisions? Do you have some specific thoughts on how AI governance could or should adapt to better reflect this ordinary ethics framing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the ways in which we have been thinking about at Data and Society, we've been thinking about the issue of impact is, how do we actually make the interface between machines and people more manageable? And that, to a certain extent, takes on a wide variety of different formulations as we think through these categories that I identified earlier. So let's just talk about, for example, what is a mandatory data that is required for you to access any service. It can, in many contexts, it's fundamentally about, the new digital ID systems that are biometric based that are being introduced across the world, and then they become your interface to any kind of government service. But one of the things that you'll constantly realize in basically designing these services and digitizing them is that government services tend to only work, for example, on a computer, and they don't work as well on mobile phones, despite the fact that most of the people in the world actually access the internet through mobile phones. So here is a simple idea of why not make these services mobile friendly and simpler to access, because that's the way in which people generally access these services anyway. Um, Along these lines, part of the question that I'm thinking about is, when is it that it is okay to basically leave a decision to a computer, versus when is it that it is okay to actually question that decision and create a process where there is a human in the loop, which allows for certain kinds of redress to be actually negotiated. And that kind of speaks to Jake's point about midwives as well. It's kind of related to this idea of how do we actually create spaces for negotiation in the way in which these systems are designed, and when they don't work in anybody's particular situation, what are the ways by which we can actually solve those issues without without going into the space of the computer says no, and hence your service, this service is not accessible to you. And then finally, I think there is this element of the question of how much work people have to do in order to make these services. One of the things that you would notice increasingly that is happening over the last couple of years is that we say that these systems make things efficient. But what we are also doing is that we are leaving most of the work of data entry to people themselves. And expecting them to do this work and ensure that their data is accurate to be able to access these services. So, initially when this work was done, especially in the organization of government services, it was always a street level bureaucrat working with the citizen to get them onto a system. But increasingly what we are doing is that we are leaving that work to citizens themselves to represent themselves. I think this is valuable in the context of people who are literate, who are able to actually access these services and understand what's going on. But then it kind of becomes harder for people who are trying to just navigate how do you even read what's on a screen. So to a certain extent, this realization of the fact that, there are people in the world who still need to access these systems with the help of other people is a really important way to think about how do we make these services universally accessible. And computational systems require a certain kind of, literacy as well as familiarity with the way in which these systems work and what are the ways in which you actually provide information to them. And that is not easily accessible to everyone in the same way. We can have that expectation, but to basically follow through on that expectation requires us to basically think about what does it mean for us to represent ourselves on these systems. I remember distinctly when, in India, when I was studying India's biometric-based national ID, and there was this whole focus on digitization. I had a chat with one of the policy people in the Ministry of Information Technology, and I asked them this question of literacy. And the way they responded to it was quite fascinating. They said that, we do not anticipate that every person in the Indian population would be digitally literate. What we anticipate is that one member of their family would be digitally literate. And that is enough for them to be on this, movement of basically becoming or moving towards a digitized India. And I think that particular anticipation of, how we can think about family structures rather than individual people as a way to create some of these services, and who is, helping people navigate through these interfaces are important questions to think about when it comes to policy around these questions. And to some extent, we'll have to move beyond the individual when we think about some of these issues to then start to imagine what are the alternative ways of navigating these systems, which require, larger social structures to be in place for these systems to work as we intend them to.
Yeah, those are fantastic points, Ranjit. And it's almost like you set up the next piece really beautifully, because a lot of what you're saying around assumptions around efficiency and how that falls short when you don't account for the second order implications or the societal scale implications of those shifts, I think is very universal across contexts. So with that, maybe very quickly jumping over to Juni, because this is very relevant to the work that you all talk through in your piece around algorithmic management systems in Southeast Asia, and this concept of the gig work economy having different societal impacts depending on different assumptions that are made that feed into these systems. And so I'm curious, in your work, as algorithmic management becomes increasingly prevalent in Southeast Asia, and these systems in some ways are kind of contributing to relational breakdowns or societal breakdowns in different ways. Please share with us, some examples of how you've come across that, what that means when you treat these systems as just technologies and don't consider the broader societal structure in which they actually have to operate.
So to set the context, our paper looks at how algorithmic management run by large online platforms affect societal relations. And we used the case study of app-based drivers in Southeast Asia. So these would include like ride-hailing and delivery apps that are broadly equivalent to Uber. So in this part of the world, it would be Grab, GoTo, Foodpanda, for instance. So expanding a bit on what algorithmic management means, I think it would be a good place to start. It is the use of algorithms to perform management functions, such as planning, staffing, commanding, coordinating, and controlling. And using AI, these management functions can be fully or partially taken over by automated decision-making as algorithms learn from like large amounts of data collected from within and outside of the organization. So with the rise of digital labor platforms mediating the supply and demand of services, algorithmic management is able to provide, to make it really easy, relatively easy, for logistical difficulties for coordinating labor transactions between millions of users in a very timely manner. So this is not something that we had before. And tasks that can be largely automated include like job matching between the supply and demand sides, dynamic price setting, and incentive structures for both the supply and demand sides, and then monitoring and quality control of service provision. So we wrote this piece in the collection because we saw a gap in literature which has focused mostly on working conditions of platform workers and the lack of transparency and autonomy when it came to algorithmic decision making. So these problems we would consider as violations and negative impacts at an individual worker level. But much less discussed, however, are how algorithmic management by platforms actually affects the nature and quality of relationships between individuals, or how we relate to each other within society. So we see three main phenomena from our case study. So if we move our view from the individual to the relational, we can actually see some structural transformations. So including like three things that we've observed. So firstly, there is the individualization of work. So platform workers find it difficult to form sustainable connections with their managers, especially when their managers essentially an algorithm, and coworkers or clients, and therefore they find it very difficult to negotiate for better terms or to organize collective action. So secondly, there is a vacuum in place of established duties and obligations between buyers and suppliers of labor. So workers are defined vaguely as driver partners, and they're treated as independent contractors on the platform. But however, they are dependent on the platform for job access, and they lack the decision-making power on pricing and work conditions. So by not defining drivers as employees, platforms skirt standard labor regulations, such as having to provide a minimum wage, paid leave, overtime, and a notice period of dismissal, for instance. And the lack of employment status clears the slate of established duties and obligations of each party that would exist, for example, within an employer-employee type of relationship, right? So thirdly, another relational impact would be an intense concentration of power, and algorithmic management just intensifies the concentration of power by platforms and the owners of platforms. And the power afforded to them brings about this information asymmetry, and they're able to make unilateral business decisions. And this creates an environment of opacity, extractivism, and a lack of accountability. So with these 3 points above combined, workers' ability for collective action to gain clear employment status, to improve their working conditions, to gain clarity on parameters of automated decision-making that shape their access to work is very much severely diminished. We can see that drivers have tried to counter the relational impacts by building networks and informal communities around a mutual aid logic with strong social commitment to support and help each other in times of need. However, these are mostly decentralized and reactive. And over the long term, it would be better to establish formal channels and institutionalized processes to clarify the responsibilities of platforms. So starting from employment classifications, for instance, that include app-based workers. So the purpose would be to ensure that the gains from workers organizing are enshrined in laws and processes, like policy processes, so that past efforts at defining roles and responsibilities can be built upon without the workers having to renegotiate terms repeatedly.
Thanks, Ginny. And I think you've laid out the problem really well, and you've started to hit on some of the potential solutions that can address some of these issues. But maybe I can turn to Rachel for the hard part, which is, again, what do you do about this, right? So these are issues that, and I would also say these are issues that affect many throughout the world. Again, lots of these issues are universal. I think there are distinct challenges when it comes to those in the global majority because of these issues of power asymmetries that you mentioned, Junie, and the issue of agency and ability to mobilize. So Rachel, tell us how you fix this. How do you address this? What are some ideas that you've seen that could offer some sort of policy hope?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think we do need to start by taking more of a socio-technical policy mindset. So what I mean by this, policy-making concerns regarding the platform economy were rooted in concerns over customer safety and worker rights to social protections. And so, for example, Southeast Asian governments made efforts to regulate the ride-hailing sector to address those concerns. So countries in the region require that drivers be registered, that vehicles used for ride-sharing jobs meet certain minimum requirements. And Malaysia has even made it mandatory for ride-hailing drivers to contribute to the country's national social security plan for self-employed workers. However, these regulations, while they are important and while they are necessary for worker rights, don't address the relational impacts that we're talking about, the relational impacts of algorithmic management on worker welfare and well-being. So shifting from policies that focus more on workers to policies that govern technologies and platforms may be more useful in tackling these social technical issues, addressing both technological challenges while protecting worker rights. So as an example, regulations that specifically address algorithmic management can provide checks and balances in the platform economy. In China, there are Internet Information Service algorithmic recommendation management provisions. And these have been enforced since 2022. And while they deal mainly with online content, they also include regulations for labor management recommendation algorithms, such as those used by food delivery platforms. And because this law required it, platforms would register their algorithms in China's algorithm registry and then went on to report taking measures to use algorithms that gave drivers more time to deliver orders and allowed the drivers to ask for more time if they needed to. And so this shows that it is possible to nudge platforms to alter the priorities of their algorithms and take responsibility for the decisions made by their technologies, the platform roles in labor relations. Governments could also learn from the two-tiered approach that's taken by the European Union. So in this case, large platforms can be held in check by antitrust regulations or gatekeeper regulations, such as the Digital Markets Act, which was also adopted in 2022. So this act requires that large online platforms providing core services, the gatekeepers, they require that they comply with rules aimed at ensuring a fair market. And what's important here is that not all platforms are held to the same rules. So large platforms with disproportionate influence in the market would face stricter rules than smaller platforms. And in this way, platforms whose algorithms are likely to affect a larger proportion of workers can be regulated more closely. So this kind of two-tiered regulatory model could hold larger platforms accountable while giving smaller platforms the opportunity to innovate and grow. At the moment, it is platform workers who bear the brunt of algorithmic management's effects, but these algorithmic management practices are spreading into traditional workforces, like factories and offices, as big data and automation become more prevalent. So we're just beginning to see how the effects of algorithmic management can really harm societal relations. But in the meantime, the isolation of platform workers that Junie was talking about can make it hard for them to make connections and find solidarity, which can hinder their ability to improve collective working conditions. The concentration of power in the hands of corporations can deepen these social inequalities. Fortunately, human resilience is already at work in the ways that workers are organizing and demanding better working conditions. They are the people directly experiencing the impacts of technologies managing their work, and as they respond to the effects of these technologies in real time, they should be consulted on policy matters because they're the ones who are best placed to underline challenges and propose solutions. So we think that measures that support worker organizing and community building can really lead to creative community-driven solutions and more impactful policies.
Thanks, Rachel. And I really am now doubly convinced that this work should continue to drill in deeper, because I think we could have an hour-long conversation just about the ideas that you've put forward here, right? There are always going to be places in which stronger algorithmic level regulations are effective. And then there are also going to be places where regulators trying to get to that level of kind of control of algorithmic management might do more harm than good, right? But then also this idea of the two-tier system, I think that that's a really valuable path to go down further when you're thinking about how you, especially in an emerging market, how you fuel innovation and don't stifle, you know, emergent competition while also trying to address the issues of power imbalances that come when these large kind of heavy hitting big tech corporations have a very outsized footprint. So much fodder there for a much deeper discussion. Hopefully we can have that down the line. But at this point, in the interest of time, I want to say thank you very much to our first round of panelists. Stay here. We'll be coming back to you all with the questions from the audience. And now we'll move over into panel number 2. So we can welcome our 3 panelists for panel number 2 now. Let me introduce our esteemed panelists for panel number 2 now. We have Carolina Botero, former CEO and current advisor to the CEO at Charisma Foundation. We have Vukosi Maravit, the ABSA UP, let me find my actual official title for you. At the University of Pretoria, Vukosi has done several things, but my first introduction for you is that you are the co-founder of Masakane and Lalapa AI and the Deep Learning Indaba. So very esteemed panelists, but your day job, so to speak, is at the University of Pretoria. And then we also have Chijioke Okorie. Hello, Chijioke. You're also at the University of Pretoria with Vukosi, and you're the lead of the Data Science Law Lab. So happy to be joined by the 3 of you. I want to make sure that we continue on from the previous discussion that we've been having around some of the issues that arise when certain principles don't translate into practice because of the context, because of the different historical power asymmetries, all of the different things that we've been discussing. Many of those issues carry on into the work that you all have done for this project. But specifically for this discussion, I want us to zero in on the concept of openness, right? So this is something that features heavily in the work that all of you do. And I think this is something that in the context of the global majority, the global South, has long been a very welcome principle because of the way that it addresses power centralization in the production of code, in the production of data. And the more that we can embrace openness, the more that we can equalize the playing field, right? This is a very positive trend that has been embraced by the digital technology community for quite some time. But the thing that I want us to highlight and spend some time discussing in this panel is the ways in which openness as a principle sometimes faces limitations in practice, whether that's because of contextual realities, whether that's because of different assumptions that are made inherent to the process of openness. And both pieces that we'll talk through today have explored different nuances around those concepts. So I want to start first with a quote from your paper, Wukosi and Chijioke, just to kind of lay out what we're talking about. When we say openness when it comes to AI, often people go straight to openness of model weights, foundational models. We're not just restricting ourselves to talk about that, right? When we are talking about openness in this context, we really take a broad lens. I want to quote directly from your piece to help clarify what we're speaking specifically about. Just to begin with, as an ideal or practice, openness in artificial intelligence involves sharing, transparency, reusability, and extensibility that can enable third parties to access, use, and reuse data, and to deploy and build upon existing AI models. This includes access to developed data sets and AI models for purposes of auditing and oversight, which can help to establish trust and accountability in AI when done well. So very concise definition, and I want to emphasize that last piece of when done well, right? So maybe, Wukosi, we can start with you. I'd like to start by focusing on the when done well part and then learn from the work that you've done with your exploits with Masakane, with the NLP community throughout the continent writ large, right? Can you speak a little bit about what you've done to pursue these goals of openness, how you've been able to bring this principle into practice in the context of African languages for the purposes of NLP research? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having me here, and also the work over the last year or so. Yeah, with Masakane, when we started, was as I guess a provocation to the way that a lot of natural language processing research had been done before. You had this situation where, if you look back to, I think, 2019, 2018, you look at low resource languages, which we would look at a lot of languages, actually the majority of languages in the world, not having as many resources as English, French, German. And as such, if you're building any AI models or any tooling, actually, it doesn't need to be AI for languages, it's hard because you just don't have the basic digital infrastructures. So with Masakane, it had been a time where the other organization, the Deep Learning Indaba, had been in existence, brought together the grassroots and saying, we're building a community of AI on the African continent, and we should start really looking at some of our toughest problems and finding ways to use this community to really tackle them. So Masakane means let's build together in isiZulu, right? So let's build these infrastructures. Let's work together on these tough problems. And by identifying a few initial areas that we could all use almost like the human resource together and use open sets of data that were available at the time to work on the first bit of work out of Masakane was in translation, in thinking how do we work together as many different pieces of people, not just natural language processing, but then also people who are coming from what do we call it, linguistics communities, to sit there and see how we build translation models, and then from these translation models see how well they actually work, evaluate them, and really become participatory. So you could then say, people came in, they looked at translation, they built their translation models and provided a lot of new benchmarks that weren't there before. And this also created a new way to think about communities coming, really taking up responsibility and saying, we can do this ourselves in many ways. You're not going to wait for the big tech or other organizations that are going to come from the West to be able to do this for us. This then also created then a lot of not just expectation, but the reality inside Masakane that a lot of the work that is done is in the open. So you find a lot of papers that are connected with Masakane. They create data. The data is available openly. They might have a restriction here and there sometimes for for example, things like no non-commercial licenses, but they are open and the data is available. And that also, as time went on, built up more and more requirements to have more and more funding that allows the creation of data sets, right? We now have come to see that to really scale AI models, you need to have access to data. And in some other spaces, then it meant also finding new avenues for this to happen. So one, I sit on the Lacuna Fund and the steering committee, where there we grant funding for a lot of creation of AI data across the global majority. And then, like, as time goes on, as this keeps on developing, then the other side of, hopefully that we have everything being done well comes in that now having data is not just enough, because do you have the compute? Do you have the choices to make when you're building that model? If you don't have compute and you release data, the people who really can exploit what comes out of these communities is not the communities themselves. And this brings us then to thinking about this as almost being, again, an extractive practice, that communities are working to preserve their languages in the way that they can, but then a huge amount of benefits actually are still accruing to where power used to lie anyway, as opposed to those communities necessarily, and that has to be balanced.
I think this is one of the more interesting tensions that's kind of shocked me, is just how much that plays into this historical imbalances of power that AI is exacerbating significantly if we're not careful about building safeguards to address that. And I'm curious, you've worked significantly together on the issue of not just how you put openness into practice in terms of the necessary components, like you mentioned, Bukosi, the infrastructure, the compute, the ability to benefit from these open data sets, but also the policy environment, right? The legal restrictions that are in place or are not in place, or that can inhibit researchers from benefiting from this, that present themselves across different contexts. And so Chijioke, I want to turn to you with that kind of backdrop. When you think about how you actually derive benefit from these data sets, from all of these resources that communities are working so hard to establish and to kind of address the gap in underrepresented languages and whatnot, what are some of the challenges that you would note from a policy lens, from a regulatory lens, that come up in this process that either help or hinder this goal of openness?
Okay, thanks, Obra, for bringing us together and for having me. So, in terms of challenges and in terms of prospects or opportunities, one of the things that you've picked up from what Vukosi said is some of the ways in which openness is both a solution but also a challenge as well, because what brought about openness is, in many cases, because of the way that the laws are set up, the regulatory framework is set up. It's set up in such a way that there are proprietary rights that one could claim over these data sets, proprietary rights that one could claim over the tools that are built off of these data sets and off of this great contribution that the communities are making. So on one hand, you have those regulatory frameworks that allow people to claim proprietary rights, which those communities that Bukosi is part of try to circumvent, as it were, or try to remedy the situation through open licensing practices, where you are taking matters into your hands and saying, I'm building this, but I'm going to openly share it. I'm going to openly make it available for people to use. But then you start to worry about what happens down the pipeline, where now you've made it open. Now you've relinquished some sort of proprietary rights that you would have had over those things. But how does the outcome of those tools that have been built off of your efforts, how does those outcomes come back to you, or how do you benefit from them? And so so that's one aspect. And then you think about the aspect of copyright law specifically that makes provisions for copyright exceptions, where now you don't actually need to be licensing anything, but you can leverage on copyright exceptions to build things, to take benefit of those things that are built without needing to ask anyone for permission. So there's that. Those are the two main challenges that you have. A typical example that sort of connects also with what Vukosi has said is, so think about a situation where we both have access to the same resource, but what you have in order to take the benefit of the resource is more than what I have. So even though we have equal access to something, our opportunity to make the best of what we now have equal access to isn't the same. And those are some of the points that we've made. In terms of, so those are the challenges. In terms of thinking about solutions, there's always thinking around what can regulatory and legislative reforms do for us, but that takes quite a bit of time. In South Africa specifically, we've been in the process of having the copyright statute amended. This has been on since 2015. This is 2024, and we haven't completed that process. So, and that's why we talk about like how can industry practices then help us to sort of address those challenges.
I think that's maybe it's a blessing in disguise, Chijoke, that the legal process takes this long, because now this copyright law can address AI's challenges, right? Silver linings. But I think that the things that you hit on both tie to Carolina's work, but I think also it's worth recognizing, again, are very universal, right? As people are trying to leverage AI to do X, Y, or Z, the issue of copyright comes up time and again with, scraping of the internet, scraping of public sources. And many folks have been dealing with the headache of how to handle this in legal courts. I think it was just recently, Carolina, this past week, a French regulator, I believe, fined Google 250 million euros for copyright infringement. This was the Dutch Data Protection Authority recently ruled that basically any scraping is considered not in compliance with GDPR, the European Data Protection Regulations. So I think this is a very universal challenge that many people are grappling with in terms of the legality of some of the techniques that fuel NLP and fuel these large language models. But I think the thing to emphasize here, and I want you to speak to this in the context of your work, Carolina, in Latin America, is what kinds of issues are in place or are not in place that add further nuance to these challenges and create divides between how the global north might be addressing these challenges and those specifically in Latin America in terms of the policy environment, and also specific examples of how a lack of access inhibits certain goals' progress.
Thank you, Obra, very much for inviting me and for getting me here. I agree totally with you that the main focus has been on fear, on how we need to protect from a point of view of copyright the space. But I wanted to talk precisely on the opposite, as you've mentioned, because today researchers are more and more using text and data mining. Text and data mining is not a synonymous of artificial intelligence, but rather it is a technique of artificial intelligence that allows or that needs to make a lot of copies of large volumes of content that is somewhere, like books, articles, images, database, and often other copyrighted materials. And then they take those content and subject them to text and mining process. The content might be freely available, but it might be protected by copyright. So I will explain with an example that is used in the paper. The World Health Organization warned the public on January 6, 2020 about the coronavirus outbreak. But Blue Dot, a Canadian digital health company, detected early signs of this in Wuhan and sent an alert to its customers in December. So a couple of weeks before WHO. Blue Dot was able to identify the outbreak thanks to the use of TDM techniques to mine and analyze large volume of news reports and scientific publication, both copyrighted. Pandemic was really a changing point to understand TDM because many research projects related to COVID were using or end up using this technique. Because of that, the issue that accessing large amounts of content by researchers could be a legal risk became up into the public, but there was already people thinking about that, because as society we want researchers to have access to everything to feed their works. However, something like what happened with Blue Dot is possible because they are located in Canada. It would be not possible if it was located, for instance, in Latin America. This is a problem because it shows an imbalance. Copyright is not being properly balanced in all the countries, and balanced towards other human rights, such as the right to research. The right to research is part of the freedom of expression as to the extent that it's the exercise is linked to the right to access of information. The paper explains how researchers in the minority work are protected, and therefore those societies are able to protect the rights to education, research, culture, science. Their systems of intellectual property include restrictions to the exclusive right as exceptions in favor of researchers, or just what Quixote was talking about. The problem is that the problem that this paper addressed is that while researchers in the minority world have legal security to engage in this sort of activities, this is not the case for researchers in Latin America and other parts of the developing world. In our countries, the state, the legislator, had not addressed this. They are not yet protecting the researchers that are vulnerable and in the disadvantage to engage in certain research projects. It is fair to say that researchers are protected or not depending on the place that they are located, and this should change.
Carolina, those are, yeah. I'm curious if you have specific thoughts on how that change can happen, right? What are some of the actions that can be taken at a national level to promote that kind of change?
The point is that copyright, despite that there is like this tendency, global tendency, the truth is that copyright or intellectual property in general, it responds to local laws. So you're right. How do we address this is a local issue. When we, as part of a network of access to knowledge in Latin America, we looked into the laws of 19 countries, and we found out that if I ask this question, a team of biologists wants to train a machine learning model using thousands of images of plants and animals from the internet, with the goal of creating an application that recognizes all types of plants and animal species in the region. And we ask, is this legal? It will be no in 18 of the jurisdictions. Only one, which is Cuba, the answer could be uncertain. Whereas if you have this exact same scenario and you look into the US law, you might say this is possible because of fair use. And in Europe, you would say yes, because Articles 3 and 4 of the directive for a single market allows that specific kind of use. So there is an imbalance there, and we need to address this imbalance by understanding that the intellectual property system has been doing a great job during the last decades to increase protection for right holders, but not the same kind of balance. It has not reached the same kind of balance for in order to protect other human rights. Those cases are left to national laws, and as I show you in Latin America, this has not worked. So there are two roads to do what you were saying. On the one hand, work at the international level. And I have to say that African countries had done a great job by bringing to WIPO the need for this kind of balance. And last year, the Committee on Copyright and Related Rights at WIPO has accepted and approved a program for work presented by the Africans to work on international level to try to balance this stuff. Specifically, one of the priorities is research, and TDM will be part of it. But this will take years, as often international lawmaking do. So our proposal, or my proposal, explained in the paper, is to take advantage of the increasing interest that artificial intelligence national strategies are having in the region, and use them to explain and make it clear that unless we we have balanced IPs, we won't be able to use the capacities of development and innovation that artificial intelligence promise. This is a critical factor of AI development, the TDM, and researchers need to be part of it. So just to give you some data, when we looked in 2023, there were 6 countries in Latin America that already had strategies and 2 more that were going to that. So that's 8 countries. 5 of them recognize IP specifically as an intellectual property as an important issue for artificial intelligence. However, only 1, that was Brazil, was dealing with the TDM issue. And therefore, we think that it will be good to promote this and to look into Brazil, because otherwise, when we discuss this issue at WIPO, there will be no position from the Global South. And again, the truth is that so far, the global North has not had the interest to balance exceptions and limitations. We need to do it, so it's on us.
Yeah, a really great note to end on, I think, because you've made the case very starkly. Just even asking the question, is it legal across different jurisdictions, that paints the picture very starkly. If it's not legal to carry out fundamental research that would benefit humanity in the Global South in the same way that it is in the Global North, that's something that needs to be addressed, and there are clear channels through which to do that. I just want to say thank you again, both to this panel and the preceding panel, because we do have to wrap up and move to audience questions. But I think it's clear from this discussion, we could continue to talk about these issues a lot longer, and I think we should. So that'll be saved for another time. But at this point, I want to make sure that the audience has a chance to ask you all questions as well. So what we'll do now is we'll shift into the next segment where Elena Noor, a senior fellow from the Asia program at Carnegie, will be stepping in to moderate and interact with all of you and answer questions from the audience. So Elena, I will hand it over to you at this point.
Thanks so much, Abra. I've really enjoyed listening to all your insights, but also had the real pleasure of reading all your papers, and I hope we can dig into some of that through the audience questions, which we've already started to receive. I may be tempted to call on you specifically, on some of you, but please feel free to raise your hands if you do want to answer any of these questions. Or if you don't want to answer, feel free to also shake your head vigorously or put your hands up in protest. Either way is fine. So perhaps let me start with the first question from the audience. I have a whole bunch myself, but I think I should prioritize audience questions. And the first question is on the finality of AI's answers, that in fact they are not. And so how do we train people to understand that it's okay or feasible to negotiate with technology? Again, I have some names in mind that I'd like to call on. Would anybody like to take a stab at this to begin with? Ranjit, please.
Yeah, this is a great question. Also, because there is a parallel line of work that is happening, I think, in the past 2 years, which is kind of focused on over-reliance as an issue, where part of the question is how do we actually stop people from over-relying on systems that we know are faulty in one way or the other. And kind of this speaks to questions of explainability. It speaks to questions of, how do we actually have a healthy relationship with these technologies rather than just relying on them as a way to basically solve problems. One of the recent interventions that I've seen in this space was in the context of basically encouraging people to red team large language models. And it was kind of designed around the idea that, when you can break these systems, you would know that they are breakable in a way. And it kind of works simultaneously as a way to think a little bit more about how these systems are fallible and at the same time be cognizant of the fact that this is happening. So, it can happen in other contexts and other ways of thinking about this as well. So to some extent, there is something to be said about encouraging people to actually make these models produce faulty outputs. That's the best way of not relying on them, because you can recognize that, it's something that, can happen in ordinary situations as well. If you can create these answers in specific contexts. And the other part of it is to recognize that, to some extent, these relationships are grounded in, a particular set of arrangements where any decision impacts somebody else. And as soon as we kind of take that impact seriously, it becomes important to actually consider, is this legitimate and right, before we actually say that this is what the machine said. So sorry, in a way.
Fantastic. Thanks for starting us off. Jake, I'd like you to jump in here and offer your own insights.
So I'll just add, from a legal perspective, I think that people should feel confident to be able to interrogate or negotiate outcomes from AI systems. And currently, at the international level, from the legal perspective, actually, we are coming up with a right to contest bias for individuals to ensure that they have a right to meaningful explanation where they suspect bias from an AI system may have occurred. And this is not new. This is, if you look at Article 15, sub 1 of the GDPR, or I think Article 22 as well, individuals should explore the right to be able to say, well, I don't understand how this AI system came up with this outcome for me. Is there a way that I can contest it? Is there a way that I can seek proper information? Is there a way that I can report that this is treating me quite differently from the way that it treats other people? So that finality should be able to be questioned. And if there's no opportunity for that, that's also an issue in terms of the development side. But the right to contest bias is one of the rights that we seek to promote and enforce, especially with people to just understand that right exists, and these are the ways that they can deploy it.
I love that idea, and I want to pull that thread a little, if I may, Jake. And my own bias is I'm a lawyer by training, but I also understand that legal processes can take a long time. And so if there is a decision that's impacting a person's financial standing, for example, and to draw on Ranjit's earlier example, if someone is waiting to rent a house and is expecting a baby, and the legal process takes longer than the time of gestation of a baby, how do we resolve something like that?
I mean, the law is not always a solution, to be honest with you. We're still quite conscripted with technical, obsolete legal principles. Unfortunately, AI is proliferating really fast, so it's difficult for the legal systems to change or to meet that way. So I'm going to admit that the law is sometimes very slow. It's also not as progressive as we want it to be. But I'm not saying it as a silver bullet. I'm saying it's also one of the avenues, especially where there's a critical condition. For example, you need it for your housing or something so quite critical. So we've seen where the courts have issued like a debiasing order, for example, where they've asked developers to go back and debias their techniques or debias their models to ensure that they can remedy the bias in a system that causes harm to specific people. Google, for example, has rolled out debiasing initiatives. We're seeing a lot of courts that are using old, I won't call them old principles, but extant principles in newer ways. So I'm not saying going to court or filing a report is always a way to go, but it's one of those ways that can get action on a very strict level.
Thank you for that. I wasn't just contesting you to be provocative, but I just really wanted to know. I understand that a few other of our panelists also want to jump in. So let me turn to Carolina and then to Jun-Yi. Carolina, please.
Thank you, Alina. Actually, I wanted to go the way you were going, because I totally agree with my previous panelist points. But I would like to say that part of the problem that we are having is that people don't even know that they are being object of the bias by an artificial intelligence. And I think that's a step previous that we need as a society to deal with. For instance, in Colombia, the how do you call that? The welfare system that provides small aids to people because they are poor or they whatever is a score, right? And this score is done with an algorithm that use data that we don't know. In fact, in the law, it says that the algorithm is secret. They can't tell how they feed, what the data is fed in the algorithm and how was the process of the algorithm. That you can't tell because because they need to protect that. as a secret. Therefore, there is no right to do the context bias. But the main problem is people don't even know that they are being scored by an algorithm. They end up thinking, oh, the score is not fair. I was here and now I'm here and I don't know why. Probably it was the survey in my and people will even go to the judicial system, but not because of the algorithm. That is the structural problem behind, but because of small things. So the problem, even though it's big, it's very fragmented because people yet do not understand the role of the artificial intelligence in that part. So I think we have to go a step back and start thinking on the question: how do we train people to understand? It's okay to negotiate with the technology. And the first thing is, how do we oblige? Let's say the state, or how do we mandate the state to be transparent on where they are using artificial intelligence? And probably I like the what you were saying, Chiboke, on the midwife, and how can we explain that to people, that this algorithm is provoking an action, right, that denies their right. I think those are previous steps. I don't have the answer, but that needs to go before, because people do not even know that they are object of this bias.
Thank you. That's a really important point. Junyi, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to put in a point on how sometimes people might have grievances and they might be annoyed at what decisions have been handed to them, whether if they're consumers or maybe they're workers. The problem really is that there is no grievance process. I mean, we need to put in the process for people to direct their negotiations, I feel. Otherwise, they will want to negotiate if they're angry enough, but they don't have a channel to do that. Like, for instance, I was talking to an expert on consumer protection before in Malaysia, and then she was recommending that we really need to build some sort of alternative dispute resolution mechanism for consumers, right? And in the form of, I don't know, arbitration or something, or some parties that will actually also facilitate the negotiations. So I think all of these really have to be put in place before we expect people to actually stand up for themselves, to just really give them the channels to do so.
And I think same caveat applies, right? They have to be aware that such a grievance process would be in existence. Thank you all. Let me get to the second question about part of this is data mining, of course, but how do we compensate communities for the use of their language? Vukosi, I feel like this might be a question that you would be able to answer, but feel free to tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, this is the bane of my existence at the moment, trying to figure out this answer. Literally every day, I don't know how many hours I have to spend looking at this question, and I'm actually meetings this afternoon thinking about this, and I had meetings this morning, and I keep on going like, when do I get back to my computer science? And this is a very important question. There's a part of, I think, connected to the previous question. I think finding ways that communities in either a very hyper-local way, as nations, as continents, to really understand these technologies and understand what it means for AI to be built is important, because I think by giving them that information and giving them that understanding, they don't need to be professors, they don't need to get PhDs in computer science, but understanding how computing works, how we build these systems, it allows them to really even start asking these questions of, I would like to either volunteer my data, or I might want to volunteer my language information, because by doing so, it allows my language to be preserved in specific ways. But at the same time, I want to make sure that the people who are providing that content can be, if they can be compensated fairly for their time, because there is value in what they are providing. So the reason that there's tension there is that, for example, if somebody doesn't know this, right, for them it's, oh, I'm just spending a couple of hours I provide this, and sure, that's how much that I think about it. But the value on the other side is, for somebody, it might be billions in protecting their market dominance, right? So there's a huge disparity because there's an information asymmetry, right? So one way is, yes, fair compensation that is connected to the value of the work that they do. And then for the people who can volunteer, they volunteer with that knowledge and being given that information. And then lastly is this conversation that is very tense that's happening on looking at things like tiered licensing that should it be that the people who are then exploiting that value on the other side also then get to a point where they are either paying royalties or finding ways. It's not that I know how to implement it. It's just that we need to be thinking about these kind of things, because ultimately there are these market forces that for now are driving a lot of the reactions. Why can it be that it's only the New York Times that can sue these big companies, right? But the small person cannot ask the same question and say, but for me, no, I'm not, I don't count. See, so it's like almost like what the elephant's fighting, right? The elephants can fight, but then, ultimately, there's still bigger losses for the ground, or for the people who are really the ones who are trying to make sure that their languages become really active or continue being there 100, 1,000 years from now. Yeah, so that's my short answer. Is almost like there is no, I don't have a clear answer, but I welcome the continued discussions.
And you'll be taking this answer to your next meeting and the ones after that, right? Thank you, Mukosi. Chijioke, did you want to jump in on this question as well?
Yes, for sure, because Vukosi and I are always having these conversations around like how is it going to work and what's going to happen. And I wanted to start by pointing out some of the things that we said in our paper, which is that the interests of the specific stakeholders vary, right? So I might want money for what I have put in. Another person might want recognition. Another person might want to be able to use the tools sometime in the future without necessarily having to pay for it. So it's so compensation shouldn't be seen just as a financial return for whatever contribution one is making to this whole project, but for us to be able to recognize the varied interests of the specific stakeholders. So a tiered licensing, which is one of the ideas that Vukosi and I keep talking about, and which has come up in other fora as well, is valuable because of the fact that at the foundation of it is the recognition of the fact that interests are varied, and what I want might not be what you want, but we are doing the same things, right? So you want to be able to speak to stakeholders where you find them. You want to be able to be contextual and nuanced enough to recognize those differences in interest. So for some, it could be a benefit sharing arrangement where there's money flow, where if you're making money from, if it's a commercial venture for you, then you get to also compensate those people who are contributing openly to these projects. In some cases, it could be that you are saying these are the tools that we are going to be developing or be producing from having access to these data sets or to these data. And because these tools are relevant to your community, we will give back, or we will allow you a different kind of payment system as opposed to what other people who haven't contributed to the project are doing. So long story short, it's important to recognize the variety of interest that needs to be taken account of in the compensation project, as it were.
Thank you, Chijioke. That's a really important nuance. And I think some of the indigenous data governance initiatives that are already out there in different parts of the world could also lend some really helpful lessons to how to address this issue of compensation, because compensation could also look like don't touch our language. And so I think your point is very well taken. We are running out of time, but I just wanted to give maybe a minute or so to anybody who would like to make a final point that we haven't addressed but would like to be addressed in this session. I know we can go on for another 10 hours given the breadth of the subjects that we've covered. So maybe I'll just do a quick scan, and if I don't see any hands shoot up, I'm going to attempt to wrap us up. Okay. Look, I think this has been a really good, robust, and thorough start to a much longer conversation that is really necessary, because there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lack of understanding around some of the issues that we've discussed in this past hour and a half. And we've traversed a whole gamut of not only issues, but we've also traversed a number of geographies, which I think speaks to the commonalities that a lot of our different regions, whether it's in Africa, whether it's Latin America, whether it's Southeast Asia, face together, but in different ways. And to that point, what we at Carnegie are trying to create is a network of scholars and practitioners who work on just these issues that affect the global majority or the global south when it comes to AI matters. A lot of what we read in the headlines is often focused on global north, and we assume that it transposes very well onto other parts of the world. And clearly it does not, as I hope we've discovered today in this conversation. If you have any ideas, whether it's you panelists or you, the audience, on how to fortify this network, how to make it a little more active so that these conversations come more to the fore, we're all ears. Please send us your suggestions, your feedback. But I also want to remind you that the panelists that we featured today is just one part of the conversation, and you should expect more of these types of articles to come out in the coming weeks. So please keep an eye out on releases from Carnegie on this AI and Global Majority or Global South project. I also want to remind you that the papers from the panelists that we featured today are available on our website, and I strongly encourage and recommend you to read them, because they will enlighten you, even if you think you have a good grasp of some of the issues that we've discussed today. And I think it really sets the stage for a more thorough exchange amongst all of us who may or may not be familiar with this topic. So with that, let me thank again the panelists for spending their time with us today across different time zones. And thank you all for tuning in. Again, if you have any feedback, please feel free to reach out to us, suggestions on how to strengthen this network. We hope to engage with you on further discussions on this issue. And until then, stay tuned for more. Thanks very much, everyone.